Hello and welcome to another video. Today on the Ants USA Ant channel, I will be showing you guys a new ant colony I have been keeping, which just got its first workers. So let's begin. This is my brand new colony of dark rover ants. Scientifically known as Brachymyrmex patagonicus, this species of ant, at least to my knowledge, is the second smallest in North America, after certain species of thief ant. This has not always been the case, however, as they were introduced into North America by humans from their native habitat in South America. As you can see, this colony has 3 queens, located here, here, and here. These 3 queens are very prolific, as in just for short weeks, the colony has a large brood pile, which even contains pupae, and a lot of nenidics, which are the initial workers of an ant colony. As you may be able to tell, the queens are going to need a lot of food in order to continue laying large quantities of eggs. So I decided it was finally time to give the colony their first meal. In order to give the ants their first meal, I would need to connect their test tube to this mini outworld. This mini outworld has 2 connection ports on each side, which can be used for connecting test tubes, tubing, or can just be plugged up. The removable lid has mesh for ventilation, along with a smaller lid for dropping in food without taking the entire lid off, which minimizes escapes. I plugged up 3 of the 4 ports, as we will not be needing them today. This last port will be used to attach the test tube that the colony is currently living in. The first step to connect the colony to the outworld is to remove the cotton blocker, followed by the attachment of this test tube adapter, which I will now insert into the connection port of the mini outworld. Done. The colony is now successfully attached to their new foraging area. This excited the workers, as prior to this, the only space they knew was the confinement of their test tube. It didn't take long for the workers to start venturing out of the test tube into the adapter. At least for now, however, they all turned back after a few steps. Meanwhile, I placed in their very first food offering, in the form of a drop of honey. A few minutes later, a worker finally decided to venture out of the test tube, only to go back inside after a quick exploratory mission. Not long after, however, the worker emerged back into the mini outworld, smelling the honey. As you can see, it found the drop of honey very quickly and began to feast. The ant was now filling up its social stomach, and after eating, would go back to the rest of the colony to regurgitate the honey into the mouths of other members of the colony, through a process known as trophallaxis. Another unique characteristic of this species is that their diet consists almost entirely of sugar. This is partly due to the fact that they are so small they don't need much protein to grow their colony in size. A few minutes later, the ant had returned, and was now feeding a fellow nestmate through trophallaxis. This process would continue, and eventually, every member of the colony would be fed. But to make this possible, more ants would need to feed from the drop of honey, as you can see here. The pheromone trail leading back to the nest is still not very strong, as this ant is a bit confused on where to go. So she simply decides to go back to feeding. When I checked on them after only about 10 minutes, almost every worker of the colony was feeding from the drop of honey. Their feeding response was surprisingly fast, as most colonies take much longer than this to respond, and do not recruit so many workers to the food. It was pretty cool to see them arranged in such a perfect semicircle. Now that the majority of the workers are out foraging, we can clearly see the colony's brood pile, which is very large for a colony of this age. After a few hours, the workers were still eating the honey. After this worker went back into the nest, it started to feed one of the queens, which was very good news. In this close-up, you can see that another worker comes up to and tries to feed the queen as the first worker is still doing it. Meanwhile, a different worker starts to feed one of the other queens. After the workers are done feeding the queens, they will move on to feeding the larvae. While watching this colony feed, I noticed that the workers seem to feed the rest of the colony in a certain order. They start by feeding themselves and other workers, followed by the feeding of the queens, and lastly the brood gets fed. I have also noticed this behavior with some of my other ant colonies, and this actually makes sense, because the workers are the ones bringing back the food, and they need nourishment as they have arguably the most demanding job in the colony. After the workers have egg, the queens are fed in order to keep the colony going through egg production, which are followed by the larvae, which for the most part don't do much. As you can see here, this queen seemed to be in the process of laying an egg. I noticed something a bit strange, however, as usually when an ant queen lays an egg, she bends her abdomen up near her mandibles, like this. Another thing I noticed about this queen was that, unlike the other two queens, she was not moving much and seemed to be lethargic. This led me to believe that she was infertile, which meant that she would either soon die of natural causes or be killed off by the workers. The next day, my suspicions were closer to being confirmed, as these two queens had clearly been fed due to their fat gasters, but the queen who was likely infertile had seemingly not been fed at all, and was very thin. In this close-up, you can see the difference between the queen's nourishment levels quite clearly. See how that one queen's gaster is much smaller. Yet another thing I noticed while observing the ants up close like this was how full the workers were of honey. Their so-called stomachs were absolutely full. A little while later, the drop of honey was still there. Even though this species is not known to eat much protein, they still had to have some, so I gave them this crushed baby mealworm. It didn't take very long for the ants to discover the offering, and they immediately started to drink the mealworm's hemolymph, or insect blood. I could tell they were enjoying it, because without much delay, they began dragging it towards the nest, as you can see here. They quickly realized, however, that the mealworm carcass was much too large for them to move, so they decided to eat it outside of the nest. But not after making one last attempt to move their food. Later that day, I noticed that they had tried to move it again, but ended up getting it stuck in the drop of honey. Despite this, they were clearly still interested in the mealworm, because they were still feeding on it. They weren't as interested in it as they were in the honey, because the workers likely couldn't hold much more food in their social stomachs. The next day when I took a look into the colony's test tube, I couldn't help but notice how the queen who I suspected to be infertile was now looking worse than ever, and even being harassed by one of the workers. This meant that she was most likely infertile, and would unfortunately end up being killed by the workers. I made a whole video about this process, and I recommend you watch it, if you haven't already. The day after this, my suspicions were confirmed. As you can see here, the ants were munching on the remains of the infertile queen. This was sad to see, but the queen was not bringing the colony any use, and was only eating and taking up space. The nutrients from her body would be used to nourish the further growth of the colony. Later, I saw a worker moving it outside of the nest as trash. And simply leaving it there. As we are nearing the end of the video, I would like to thank everyone for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already.